Welcome to Citizen Portal, the federal edition, your go-to source for everything happening in federal politics. Let's dive in and keep you connected to what matters most on the national stage. All right, let's jump right in. Today we're looking at a hearing from the U.S. House Committee on Rules. And, this one is about a bill called H.R. 77. It's officially called the Midnight Rules Relief Act. And, it's causing quite a stir in Washington.
Yeah, it's interesting how this bill really boils down to a power struggle between Congress and the president over, who gets the final say on regulations, especially those kind of last-minute ones that tend to pop up at the end of a president's term.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this whole midnight rulemaking thing, but I was surprised to see in the hearing transcript that the Biden administration actually finalized over 1,400 regulations in its last year.
Wow, 1,400, that's a lot.
I know, right?
That sheer volume is a big part of the argument for H.R. 77. Supporters of the bill are saying that it's just overwhelming for Congress to try to review each individual rule, and they're arguing that this bill would offer a more, streamlined approach.
So how would that even work? I mean, doesn't Congress already have the Congressional Review Act to block regulations they don't like?
Right? They do have the CRA, and it lets them overturn individual regulations, but H.R. 77, this new one, it would actually let them bundle multiple rules together and vote on them all at once. So, it could definitely speed things up, but there are also concerns about transparency and maybe some unintended consequences down the line.
Okay, so more efficiency, but maybe at the expense of a more nuanced approach. This is where things get kind of interesting because one of the rules they brought up in the hearing was the CFPB's attempt to limit overdraft fees. And they estimated that this could save households billions of dollars.
Yeah, that's right. And this is where H.R. 77 starts to hit a little closer to home. It could actually impact that CFPB rule and those potential savings.
So this is not just some political game in Washington. This could have a direct impact on people's finances.
Absolutely. And, it's important to consider both sides. While some argue that bundling regulations together is, more efficient, others are worried that it could be a way to sneak in unpopular or maybe even harmful rules.
It's like a double-edged sword. And then things get even more complicated when you factor in the hypocrisy argument. Opponents of H.R. 77 are pointing out that Republicans are suddenly really concerned about executive overreach now, but they were pretty quiet when the Trump administration was allegedly trying to, hinder the CFPB's work, basically stopping them from enforcing existing regulations.
It makes you wonder if it's really about executive power or if it's more about partisan politics.
Right. It's a good question. And there's another layer of irony here. The congressman who actually wrote H.R. 77 is a big supporter of the one bill, one subject rule, the idea that legislation should be focused and straightforward.
I see where you're going with this.
So he's pushing for a bill to streamline regulations, but it could potentially bundle multiple subjects together, which goes against his own principle.
Yeah, it does seem a little paradoxical, but keep in mind we're talking about a bill that addresses regulations broadly. So the argument is that streamlining the process of reviewing regulations all falls under a single subject, even if it ends up affecting multiple areas.
Okay, I could see the logic there, but it's definitely a head-scratcher. So to recap, we have this bill that could really shake things up in Washington, potentially affect our personal finances, and even has this kind of legislative irony built right into it.
It's a lot to unpack, and just when you thought it couldn't get any more interesting, Elon Musk enters the picture.
Wait, Elon Musk, what does he have to do with a congressional hearing on regulations?
Well, his role in exposing alleged government waste became a big point of contention during the hearing. His efforts, especially the release of the Twitter files, were highlighted by some as a form of citizen oversight. They see it as holding the government accountable.
Yeah, those Twitter files were pretty revealing, but I bet not everyone was happy about Musk getting involved.
You're right. Some people praised, but others questioned his motives and saw it as more of a politically charged attack.
It seems like everything in Washington ends up being about politics in the end. But how does this all connect back to H.R. 77?
Well, Musk's revelations kind of fueled arguments for greater congressional oversight, and it feeds into this debate about whether the Congressional Review Act is actually strong enough. Some argue that if a president can just ignore a regulation that Congress votes against, then the CRA is basically useless.
It makes you wonder if H.R. 77, with its ability to bundle all these regulations together, is maybe a response to that perceived weakness in Congress's power.
That's definitely a possibility, and to really understand the potential impact of H.R. 77, we need to look at some specific examples of the regulations and spending that came up during this hearing.
You mean like real-world stuff that could affect everyday people?
Exactly. They talked about everything from the cost of tankless water heaters to funding for international activism. These examples really show how these seemingly complex legal debates can have very tangible consequences.
Okay, yeah, let's talk about those tankless water heaters you mentioned. What's the deal with those?
Well, there's this proposed energy efficiency rule that could actually make those tankless water heaters a lot more expensive. I mean, it could even price them out of reach for a lot of households.
Wow, that's got to hurt, especially with, everything getting so expensive these days. What's the reasoning behind making them more expensive?
Well, the people who support this rule argue that stricter efficiency standards are necessary to reduce energy consumption and, help fight climate change. They see it as a crucial step towards a more sustainable future.
Yeah, going green is important, but like critics are saying, it's a case of the government overreaching, burdening consumers with these extra costs without really any tangible benefit.
Right. It's the other side of the argument. Is this a necessary step towards, a greener future, or is it just a regulation that's gone too far? It's tough.
Definitely. And it really highlights that tension we were talking about earlier, like trying to balance individual freedom with the need for, collective action on things like climate change.
Exactly. And that tension plays out in a lot of the regulations they discussed. For instance, remember those overdraft fees? The CFPB wants to limit them, which could save people a lot of money, but some people argue that it could actually backfire.
Wait, how could a rule that's supposed to protect consumers end up hurting them?
Well, the argument is that if banks can't charge as much for overdraft fees, they might be less likely to even offer overdraft protection at all. And that could leave some people with fewer options and maybe lead to more bounce checks and, financial instability.
Oh, I see. So it's like they're trying to walk this fine line between protecting consumers and, not messing things up in the market or creating unintended consequences.
Exactly. And it gets even more complex when you start talking about things like international aid and national security. The hearing also got into a regulation that would require asylum seekers at the border to pay a fee to have their cases processed.
A fee to seek asylum, that seems kind of counterintuitive. Why would they do that?
The people who support the fee say that it would help to deter frivolous asylum claims and make sure that resources are focused on people with legitimate needs. They say it would streamline the process and make it fairer for everyone.
But wouldn't that make it harder for people who are fleeing persecution to find safety, especially if they're already struggling financially?
That's exactly what the opponents of the rule are saying. They see it as a barrier to entry that could violate our humanitarian obligations and make it much more difficult for vulnerable people to seek refuge.
It's a tough situation. There are good arguments on both sides, and it really comes down to your perspective on immigration and border security and, humanitarian aid.
Exactly. It's not just about the legal aspects of the regulation. It's about our values as a nation and how we balance all these different priorities.
Okay, so we've got tankless water heaters, overdraft fees, and asylum seekers. What other kind of regulatory hot topics did they get into during this hearing?
Well, they also talked about a rule to prevent foreign adversaries from getting access to sensitive U.S. government data, including personal information.
Wait, foreign adversaries getting our data? That sounds like something out of a spy movie.
Well, it's a real concern these days with all the cyber warfare and digital espionage going on. This rule is supposed to strengthen cybersecurity measures and protect that sensitive information from, falling into the wrong hands.
That makes sense. Data breaches are all over the news lately. But what are the downsides to this rule?
Some people say that it could create a lot of unnecessary red tape and actually hinder legitimate international collaboration. They worry it could stifle innovation and make it harder for researchers and businesses to operate globally.
So again, it's about finding that balance between protecting national security and not creating unintended obstacles for, legitimate activities.
Exactly. Another regulation that sparked debate involves U.S. investments in certain Chinese companies, particularly those that deal with sensitive technologies.
Okay, yeah, I've heard about this whole thing with concerns over China's growing influence in the tech world.
Right. This rule is all about protecting American economic and technological interests in a world where competition is really heat up, especially with China. It's about making sure that the U.S. stays ahead.
Yeah, I can see why that would be a priority, but I'm guessing some people are worried about the economic fallout from something like that.
Absolutely. They're concerned that restricting these investments could actually stifle innovation and limit opportunities for both American and Chinese businesses. They say it could ultimately hurt economic growth on both sides.
So it's like this delicate balancing act trying to protect national interests without, destabilizing the global economy.
You got it. And that's what makes this whole debate about regulations so interesting and, to be honest, kind of challenging. It's not just about abstract legal principles. It's about navigating these complex, real-world situations.
My head's spinning a little bit from all these regulations and their potential impacts, but I think I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
I think you're right. This hearing wasn't just about specific rules. It was about these broader questions of how we govern ourselves, how we balance competing interests, and how we prepare for the future.
And ultimately, how these decisions in Washington are going to affect people's everyday lives.
Exactly. So having looked at these examples and gotten a taste of just how complex these regulations can be, let's shift gears and dive into some even deeper questions that this whole debate brings up.
What are some of the big picture issues that this hearing brought to light? So we've been talking about H.R. 77, the Midnight Rules Relief Act, and we've covered a lot of ground already, everything from how it could affect our wallets to concerns about government overreach, and even Elon Musk kind of popped up in the discussion.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride, for sure, trying to untangle all the potential consequences of this bill and how it could shift the balance of power in Washington.
Exactly, and we've talked about specific regulations like those tankless water heaters and the overdrive fees, but what happens if this bill actually becomes law? What are the big changes we could see?
Well, one of the biggest shifts would likely be in the relationship between Congress and the president. H.R. 77 could give Congress a lot more power to block regulations they don't like.
So basically less power for the president, more power for Congress. But wouldn't that lead to, more gridlock, more partisan fighting, especially since the CRA is kind of an all-or-nothing tool? There's no room for compromise.
That's a valid point. Critics of the bill are worried that it could basically swamp Congress with all these CRA resolutions and really slow down the whole legislative process, making it harder to address other important issues. They're also concerned that it could create this kind of regulatory vacuum if too many rules are overturned.
Right, and we've seen how these regulations, while they can be annoying, sometimes often serve a purpose, whether it's protecting consumers or the environment or national security.
Exactly. It's about finding that right balance between oversight and efficiency. Supporters of H.R. 77 say that it would just make the process more streamlined and give Congress a better way to keep the executive branch in check.
But if a president can just ignore a regulation that Congress votes against, does it really matter? I mean, is the CRA even enough?
That's the question a lot of people are asking. Some argue that Congress needs to get more assertive, maybe use its power over funding to rein in those executive agencies.
So hit them where it hurts their budget.
Exactly. If an agency isn't doing what Congress wants, they could threaten to cut their funding.
But this brings up a bigger question. What is the right amount of regulation? Where do we draw the line between protecting the public and respecting individual freedom?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's a debate that's been going on forever. There's no easy answer. It requires really thinking about the costs and benefits of every regulation, understanding the complexities of the issue, and realizing that there are often good points on both sides.
It seems like this whole discussion has been about finding that balance, that sweet spot between competing priorities.
You're absolutely right, and it's a process that needs informed citizens who are engaged in the issues and willing to speak up.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Midnight Rules Relief Act, what are some key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about?
I think the most important thing to remember is that these regulations, even though they can seem dry and technical, they have real consequences. They affect our lives in so many ways, from our finances to our health to our safety.
Exactly. Don't just tune it out because it sounds boring. Pay attention to what's happening in Washington, learn about the issues, and think about how they might affect you and your community.
Another important point is that there's rarely a simple right or wrong answer when it comes to regulation. There are often valid arguments on both sides. It's about understanding those different perspectives and having, respectful conversations.
Right. It's not about blindly picking a side. It's about being informed and making your own decisions based on the facts and the arguments.
And finally, remember that you have a voice in all of this. Contact your elected officials, let them know what you think, and be a part of shaping the policies that affect your life.
Until next time, keep learning, stay engaged, and remember that staying informed is the first step towards making a difference. Thanks for tuning in to Citizen Portal. We hope you feel more informed and ready to engage with the issues shaping our community. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an update, and visit us at citizenportal.ai for more insights on how local politics are impacting you. Until then, stay engaged, stay informed, and remember, your voice matters.